monastic site was developed, you have to try and imagine what it would have been like. Paint a little picture in your head. You wouldn't have had cars or roads or bicycles or anything like that. People would have either had to walk or go on horseback. So it would have been a very, very different place, a very remote place. So the area was developed. The story goes that there was this young man. You see, you have to remember, way back in our history, Ireland was divided up into 150 different kingdoms. So you imagine this little island all divided up in these kingdoms. So if you were living next door to one of the kings, you might be fighting with them over land and property. There would have been squabbles, as we'd call it, a squabble. But of course, eventually, what they did in order to have law and order prevail, they appointed a high king, and that high king used to sit in a place called Tara, which is north of the city of Dublin, and he would oversee law and order. So the way he did that was he would take hostages, but they were women hostages. He would take the mothers, the sisters, the daughters of all of the lesser kings and guarantee that their safe return after 1 year if the lesser kings obeyed him. So I can tell you now that there must have been law and order, because they wanted their mothers and sisters and wives back. And even still to this day, one can see what's known as the Mound of the Hostages, where the hostages were kept. Anyway, the eldest son would automatically become the next king, and the second son, maybe even the third and the fourth son, might decide to go into a monastery. Now, when you went into a monastery, this is way back now in the 600s, when you went into a monastery, you would give up all of your worldly possessions. So you would come with a dowry, in other words, and you would take vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. So these monasteries flourished freely from the 6th century right up onto the time of Henry VIII. So in this particular case, there was this young man, and he came from a noble family, and he decided that he wanted to get away from this area. He was a teacher, and so he came down on foot. It took probably several weeks, maybe indeed several months, to find this place, this valley that he found. And when he found this valley, he found a cave, and there he decided that he was going to live. And he met up with some other like-minded people, and so they started this monastic site or monastery down in the place that we're going to now, Glendalough. But this man that established it, his name was Kevin. He latterly became known as Saint Kevin, so it became known as St. Kevin's down in Glendalough. Of course, many, many years later, this was established into a great big monastery, and instead of occupying the cave, many cloisters were built, many churches were built, and the monks flourished there. There could have been as many as 200. We don't actually know how many monks were there, but there would have been several monks. And the monks would have been young men. Way back in the early times, priests could marry. So there would have been some married priests there, but the monks didn't marry. It was a different church, a different form of church. They were self-sufficient, so they grew all of their own vegetables, and they had their own animals. They would have made all of their own clothes. They would have woven the wool from the sheep. They would have raised sheep. They would have raised cattle. They would have raised goats and pigs, so that they were not dependent on anybody else. They would pray several times a day, depending on the abbot, how strict the order was. And they would lead a life of isolation, basically, very isolating themselves from the outside world. So today, when we go down to Glendalough, you'll see some of the ruins of the churches. You'll see the old cemetery. You'll see a perfect example of a round tower. So I recommend that you have your cameras with you. Round towers go back to, this one goes back about 1,000 years. So, and it's in perfect condition. So the round towers were there as lookouts. They were big, 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 tall towers. and at the very, very top you had openings. The opening was there to look out, so the monks could look to see if there was anybody approaching, unwanted guests, or they could ring the bell. In those days they would have had what was known as a tongueless bell. It was the shape of a bell, but there wouldn't be any bit in the middle, so they would bang it with a stone, and they would summons the monks in to the refectory where they might eat maybe once a day. They might eat once a day only. So they lived life of great prayer, and it's from these monasteries that you get many of the books that we would have had in Ireland, or have still some of them in Ireland. These great missals where they would have written, and they would have recorded things, and they would have had many designs in them. So Glendalough was like that. All of the monasteries in Ireland, there were a couple of exceptions. What happened was, during the time of Henry VIII of England, I've mentioned him already a few times, when he decided that he wanted to establish himself as head of the church. He broke with the Church of Rome because he was unable to marry Anne Boleyn. He wanted to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon because they had no male heir. Now, he did have an illegitimate male heir to the throne, a man called Henry Fitzroy, the title Duke of Richmond, but he wanted a legitimate heir, and so he divorced Catherine of Aragon. He didn't get permission from the Catholic Church. The Pope wouldn't give him permission, so he broke off. And at that point you had what became known as the dissolution of the monasteries. The monasteries were dissolving. Anybody that was opposed to him, he didn't want. Any monasteries that remained had to pay huge taxes. Now, you wouldn't have thought that that would have affected Ireland, and especially an area as remote as the area we're going to go to right now, but it did. The monks were afraid, and so they dispersed, and these monasteries just were left. However, we're very fortunate in Ireland that we have many of them still remaining, and bits of them intact, and that's what you're going to see this morning. You'll be able to walk around, you'll be able to take photographs, and so I recommend you take your cameras with you. This area we're going into now, County Wicklow, this is known as the Devil's Glen that we're going up along. Lots of nice big houses along here now.